The voice of Sheriff Dale Hargrove crackled through the police radio that humid August night, his words preserved forever in the Franklin County archives. It was 1982, and the cicadas sang their eternal summer song across the Alabama cotton field, indifferent to the mystery that was about to unfold. Sarah Ann Whitmore had always been punctual. Ask anyone in Russellville, the small town where she taught third grade at Franklin Elementary, and they'd tell you the same thing. Sarah was reliable as clockwork, gentle as morning rain, and carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who truly loved what she did. On that Wednesday evening, August 18th, the thermometer outside Benson's hardware store read 92 degrees at 6 o'clock. The air was thick enough to swim through, heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm that would never come. Main Street stretched sleepily between faded storefronts, Murphy's 5 and Dime, the Dixie Diner with its hand-painted sign, and the First Baptist Church, where the weekly potluck suppers drew half the town. Sarah had spent the morning preparing her classroom for the upcoming school year. Dorothy Jenkins, the principal, remembered seeing her arranging poetry books on the reading corner shelves. She had this way about her, Dorothy would later tell investigators, real gentle-like, but determined. Those children adored her. She made learning feel like magic. The afternoon heat had driven most folks indoors, but Sarah remained at school until nearly 4 o'clock, stapling construction paper autumn leaves to her bulletin board a full month early. But Sarah always planned ahead. She wore a soft blue sundress that day, one with tiny white flowers that her sister Lynette had given her for her birthday. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried the leather satchel their father had bought her when she graduated from Auburn University 5 years earlier. At 4:15 p.m., Sarah stopped by the town library. Miss Evelyn Caldwell, the librarian, remembered the conversation clearly, even decades later. She was looking for a book of Emily Dickinson's poems. Said she wanted to introduce her students to poetry that felt like whispered secrets. That was Sarah's way, always thinking about those children. By 5:30, Sarah had driven her yellow 1978 Datsun to her small rental house on Maple Street. The house belonged to the Reverend Thomas Mitchell and his wife, a modest white clapboard cottage with a front porch, swing, and a garden where Sarah grew tomatoes and sunflowers. Neighbors saw her watering her plants, still in that blue sundress, humming softly to herself. The Franklin County Church Ladies Auxiliary was hosting their annual summer fundraiser that evening at the Fellowship Hall behind First Baptist. It was a tradition as old as the town itself: homemade pies, sweet tea in mason jars, and acoustic guitar music that drifted across the parking lot into the warm night air. The money raised would go toward new hymnals and a fresh coat of paint for the sanctuary. Sarah arrived at the church at 6:45 p.m., carrying a pecan pie she'd baked that afternoon. Mrs. Ruth Patterson, who organized the event, greeted her at the door. Sarah looked beautiful that night. Ruth would remember years later. She seemed peaceful, maybe even happy. There was something different about her, like she was carrying good news. The fellowship hall buzzed with familiar voices. Folding tables covered in checkered tablecloths displayed an array of desserts: chess pie, banana pudding, blackberry cobbler, and Sarah's contribution, still warm from the oven. Children ran between the tables while their mothers caught up on the week's gossip, and their fathers discussed the cotton harvest and the upcoming Alabama football season. Sarah spent the evening moving quietly through the crowd, complimenting recipes and asking about families. She sat for a while with elderly Mrs. Florence Daniel, listening to stories about teaching in the 1940s. She helped young mothers serve dessert to restless children. She even danced one slow song with Bobby Hendricks, a shy bachelor who managed the local feed store and had harbored feelings for Sarah since high school. At 8:20 p.m., several witnesses saw Sarah cutting herself a slice of her own pecan pie. She wrapped it carefully in a paper napkin and placed it in a small paper bag. Taking some home for later, she told Mrs. Patterson with a smile. This turned out better than usual. The last person to speak with Sarah was 17-year-old Jenny Morrison, who was helping clean up. Miss Whitmore asked me about my summer reading, Jenny later told police. She said she hoped I'd continue writing stories when school started. She seemed excited about something, but not nervous, just ... hopeful. At 8:43 p.m., according to multiple witnesses, Sarah Ann Whitmore walked out of the First Baptist Church Fellowship Hall, carrying her small paper bag and her leather satchel. The parking lot was illuminated by a single streetlight that cast long shadows between the cars. She waved goodbye to a few lingering friends and unlocked her yellow Datsun. The engine started on the first try, as it always did. Sarah was meticulous about car maintenance, taking the Datsun to Jimmy's garage for regular service. The radio played softly, probably WZYP, the local station that mixed country music with weather updates and community announcements. Sarah pulled out of the church parking lot and turned right onto Highway 43, heading south toward her house on Maple Street. It was a drive she had made hundreds of times, past the Cotton Gin, past the old Sinclair station that had closed 2 years earlier, past the turnoff to the cemetery where her grandparents were buried. But somewhere between the church and her front door, Sarah Ann Whitmore vanished. The first sign that something was wrong came at 10:15 p.m., when Lynette Whitmore called her sister's house. Sarah never missed their nightly phone call, a tradition they'd maintained since Sarah moved to Russellville. The phone rang and rang, echoing through the empty cottage. By Thursday morning, when Sarah failed to appear for her scheduled meeting with the school custodian to discuss classroom arrangements, Principal Dorothy Jenkins began making calls. The yellow Datsun wasn't in Sarah's driveway. Her mail hadn't been collected. The sunflowers in her garden drooped in the morning heat, unwatered. At 11:47 a.m. on August 19, 1982, Sheriff Dale Hargrove received the call that would launch Franklin County's most puzzling investigation. A local farmer named Curtis Webb had discovered an abandoned vehicle on County Road 16, about 4 miles south of town. The car was parked neatly on the shoulder, facing east toward the tree line. The doors were locked. The keys hung in the ignition. Inside, on the passenger seat, sat a small paper bag containing half a slice of pecan pie. Sheriff Dale Hargrove had been wearing the same badge for 18 years when he arrived at County Road 16 that Thursday morning. He'd seen his share of mysteries in Franklin County: missing livestock, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in at the feed store. But nothing had prepared him for the yellow Datsun sitting pristine and empty on the gravel shoulder, as if Sarah Ann Whitmore had simply dissolved into the Alabama heat. "First thing I noticed was how neat everything looked," Hargrove would later write in his incident report. "Car wasn't crashed, wasn't damaged. Hell, it wasn't even dusty. Like somebody had just parked it there, real careful like, and walked away." Curtis Webb, the farmer who'd discovered the vehicle, stood beside his pickup truck, answering questions. He'd been driving to check his irrigation lines when he spotted the yellow car. "Thought maybe somebody had engine trouble," Webb told Deputy Frank Morrison. "But when I got closer, I could see the motor wasn't running. Keys were just hanging there, swaying a little in the breeze. The Datsun's doors were locked, but the driver's side window was rolled down exactly 2 inches, Sarah's habit during summer evenings, to let air circulate without messing her hair. Inside, everything appeared normal, almost untouched. Sarah's brown leather purse sat on the floor behind the driver's seat, containing her wallet with $43, her teaching certificate, a small tube of Revlon lipstick, and a folded church bulletin from the previous Sunday. On the passenger seat, the paper bag held its mysterious cargo, half a slice of pecan pie, the crust still intact, showing no signs of having been disturbed. A plastic fork lay beside it, unused. The pie looked exactly as it would have when Sarah wrapped it at the church fundraiser, as if time had stopped the moment she placed it there. Deputy Morrison, who had a daughter in Sarah's 3rd grade class the previous year, carefully catalogued every detail. The radio was tuned to WZYP, volume set low. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank enough to drive to Birmingham and back. Sarah's reading glasses lay folded in the console, next to a small notebook where she'd written lesson plans in her precise handwriting. Word spread through Russellville like wildfire on dry grass. By noon, the parking lot at Franklin Elementary was filled with parents, teachers, and concerned citizens. Principal Dorothy Jenkins had to post a notice canceling the afternoon faculty meeting as teachers volunteered to join the search effort. "We all loved Sarah," remembered Martha Hendricks, who taught 2nd grade. "She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who stayed after school to help struggling students, who never said an unkind word about anyone. The idea that something bad could happen to her just didn't make sense." Sheriff Hargrove organized the search with military precision. Franklin County might have been small, but its people knew every back road, every creek bed, every abandoned barn within 20 miles. Volunteers were divided into teams of 4, each assigned a specific grid to cover. They searched on foot, in pickup trucks, and on horseback, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The search expanded beyond the immediate area where the car was found. Teams combed the Sipsey River bottoms, checked every hunting cabin in the county, and walked the rows of cotton fields that stretched toward the Tennessee border. Local pilots volunteered their small planes to scan from above, looking for any sign of a blue sundress or disturbed ground. For 3 days, hope remained strong. Churches held prayer vigils. The Dixie Diner served free coffee and sandwiches to search volunteers. Radio stations across North Alabama broadcast Sarah's description every hour: 5 feet 4 inches tall, brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a blue sundress with small white flowers. Anyone with information should contact the Franklin County Sheriff's Department immediately. On the 4th day, a bloodhound named Rex arrived from Birmingham, accompanied by his handler, Detective Carl Murphy. Rex had a reputation for finding missing persons across Alabama and Mississippi. The dog was given one of Sarah's scarves to establish her scent, then led to the abandoned Datsun. What happened next would puzzle investigators for decades. Rex immediately picked up Sarah's trail from the car, following it about 50 yards east into the tree line. The trail was strong and clear, leading to a small clearing where several large oak trees formed a natural circle. There, approximately 60 feet from the road, the trail simply ended. It was the damnedest thing, Detective Murphy told the assembled search team. Rex kept circling that spot, whining and pawing at the ground, but there wasn't anywhere else for the scent to go. It was like she just stopped existing right there. The clearing showed no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth, no broken branches. Crime scene technicians from the state police found no physical evidence, no footprints other than those left by the search team. No fabric caught on thorns, no indication that Sarah had ever been there at all. As summer faded into autumn, the official search was scaled back, though volunteers continued combing the countryside on weekends. The yellow Datsun was towed to the county impound lot, where it sat like a metal monument to the mystery. Sarah's sister Lynette drove down from Huntsville every weekend, posting new flyers, and walking the same roads the search teams had covered. I kept thinking she might have amnesia, Lynette told the local newspaper 6 months later. You hear about people just wandering off sometimes, forgetting who they are. I thought maybe she'd turn up in another town, working as a waitress or something, not remembering her own name. The theories multiplied with each passing month. Some folks believed Sarah had run away to start a new life, though those who knew her best dismissed this immediately. Sarah loved teaching, loved her family, loved her quiet life in Russellville. Others whispered about foul play, though there were no suspects and no evidence of violence. The most persistent rumor involved a traveling salesman who had been seen in town the week before Sarah disappeared. He'd been staying at the Pinnerview Motel, selling encyclopedias door-to-door. Several residents remembered him asking specific questions about local families, including whether any single women lived alone. But when Sheriff Hargrove tracked down the salesman 3 months later, the man had a solid alibi. He'd been in Mississippi the night Sarah vanished, with motel receipts and witness statements to prove it. By Christmas of 1982, the missing person flyers had faded from telephone poles and store windows. The story moved from front-page news to occasional updates buried in the back sections of regional papers. Life in Russellville slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though Sarah's empty classroom at Franklin Elementary served as a constant reminder that some questions have no answers. Dorothy Jenkins hired a replacement teacher, a young woman from Montgomery who tried her best to fill Sarah's shoes. But the children noticed the difference. Miss Whitmore used to read us poems, 7-year-old Melissa Crane told her mother. She made the words sound like music. The new teacher just reads them regular. Years passed. Sheriff Hargrove retired in 1989, turning the case files over to his successor, Deputy Frank Morrison, who had been promoted to sheriff. Morrison continued, following Leeds reports of women matching Sarah's description seen in other states. Anonymous phone calls claiming knowledge of what happened. Psychics offering their services. None led anywhere. The Whitmore family held a memorial service on the 5th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. Lynette, now married and living in Atlanta, spoke about her sister's love of poetry and children. Sarah believed that words could change the world, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. She taught her students that every story matters, that every person has something important to say. I think about that whenever I miss her. Sarah's story isn't over. We just don't know how it ends yet. By 1990, the case had grown cold. The evidence boxes were moved to long-term storage in the basement of the courthouse. New mysteries and crimes demanded attention. Franklin County grew and changed New housing developments replaced cotton fields. Chain restaurants opened along Highway 43. Young people left for Birmingham and Nashville, while retirees moved in from up north. But in small towns, memory runs deeper than time. Old-timers at the coffee shop still discussed the case on slow mornings. Every August, around the anniversary, someone would inevitably mention Sarah Ann Whitmore and wonder what really happened that humid night when she drove away from the church and never made it home. The yellow Datsun was eventually sold at a county auction. A young mechanic from Muscle Shoals bought it, fixed a few minor issues, and drove it for years without knowing its history. Sarah's house on Maple Street had new tenants every few years, teachers, mostly drawn by the affordable rent and the mature garden that Sarah had planted. In 1995, 13 years after the disappearance, something strange happened that reignited local interest in the case. Mrs. Florence Daniels, the elderly woman Sarah had sat with at the church fundraiser, was cleaning out her attic when she found an envelope that had been slipped under a loose floorboard. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a poem written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. Asterisk, when evening shadows grow too long, asterisk, asterisk, and silence sings a lonesome song. Asterisk, asterisk, remember those who walked away, asterisk, asterisk, were never truly meant to stay. Asterisk, Mrs. Daniels was certain the paper hadn't been there before. She'd lived in the house for 40 years, and had been in that attic countless times. The poem wasn't in any of Sarah's notebooks or lesson plans. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, though it appeared consistent with Sarah's known sample. Sheriff Morrison reopened the investigation briefly, but the poem raised more questions than it answered. How had it gotten into Mrs. Daniels' attic? When was it written? And what did it mean? As the 20th century drew to a close, Sarah Ann Whitmore's disappearance had become part of Franklin County folklore, told and retold until fact and legend blurred together. Some versions of the story included details that had never been verified: mysterious phone calls, strange lights in the woods, prophetic dreams that had warned of danger. But the basic facts remained unchanged. A beloved schoolteacher had vanished between a church fundraiser and her home, leaving behind only a locked car and half a slice of pecan pie. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the Alabama countryside lay shrouded in mist and memory, it was easy to imagine Sarah still out there somewhere, walking the back roads with her leather satchel and her gentle smile, teaching lessons to students who existed only in the space between hope and sorrow. 23 years after Sarah Ann Whitmore vanished into the Alabama twilight, the old Sinclair station on Highway 43 was finally scheduled for demolition. The building had stood empty since 1980, its red and green sign faded to rust-colored ghosts, windows boarded up with plywood that had warped and split in decades of southern weather. Tommy Garrison, a local contractor hired to clear the lot, arrived on a humid Tuesday morning in June 2005 with his crew and a bulldozer. The plan was simple: knock down the building, haul away the debris, and prepare the site for a new Subway restaurant that would serve travelers heading north to Tennessee. Place gave me the creeps, Tommy would later tell investigators. Been driving past it my whole life, watching it fall apart, piece by piece. Always looked like something out of a horror movie, you know. Windows all black and empty. That old sign creaking in the wind. The Sinclair station had been built in 1963 by a man named Earl Hutchinson, who ran it successfully for 17 years, before a heart attack forced him to close. Earl had been a fixture in the community, big man with calloused hands, who knew every customer by name, and always had penny candy for children whose parents stopped for gas. After Earl's death in 1981, his widow, Margaret, had tried to sell the property, but the building needed too much work, and the location wasn't quite right for modern traffic patterns. Year after year, the station sat empty while kudzu vines crept up its walls and weather slowly claimed what man had built. Tommy's crew started by clearing the vegetation that had grown wild around the building. Honeysuckle and Virginia creeper had completely covered the south wall, creating a green curtain that had hidden the structure's decay. As they cut away the vines, something unexpected appeared, a small, hand-painted sign that had been completely obscured. The sign, in faded blue letters, read, "Earl's Fix-It Shop, Back Building, all repairs welcome. I'd lived here all my life and never knew." Earl had a repair shop behind the station, Tommy said. We walked around back to see what was there, and sure enough, there was this little concrete block building, maybe 12 by 16 feet, covered in so much growth you couldn't hardly see it from the road. The back building had a single metal door, secured with a heavy padlock that had long since rusted solid. The windows were so dirty and spiderwebbed that it was impossible to see inside. Tommy tried the door first, but the lock wouldn't budge, so he went to his truck for bolt cutters. The lock snapped with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the still morning air. Tommy pulled the door open, releasing a smell of old motor oil, rust, and something else, something that reminded him of his grandmother's cedar chest, closed up for too many years. Sunlight streamed through the doorway, illuminating a space frozen in time. Workbenches lined the walls, still cluttered with tools and old car parts. A 1979 calendar hung crooked on the far wall, featuring a blonde woman in a red bikini, leaning against a Chevrolet. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny spirits disturbed from decades of sleep. But it was what Tommy saw on the workbench against the far wall that made him stop breathing for a moment. A leather satchel sat in the center of the bench, covered in dust, but unmistakably well made and cared for. Beside it lay a blue sundress with small white flowers, neatly folded, as if someone had just taken it off and planned to put it on again tomorrow. Tommy backed out of the building and called Sheriff Morrison immediately. "I knew something wasn't right," Tommy later told the local newspaper. "Those clothes, that bag, they didn't belong in Earl's old shop. They looked too new, too clean, even under all that dust, like somebody had put them there real careful like, and then just walked away." Sheriff Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, followed by state crime scene investigators from Montgomery. The scene was cordoned off with yellow tape, while photographers documented every inch of the small building. What they found inside would reignite the Sarah Ann Whitmore investigation and raise more questions than it answered. The leather satchel was indeed Sarah's. Her name was embossed in small gold letters near the handle, and Lynette Whitmore confirmed it was the bag their father had given Sarah for graduation. Inside, investigators found items that painted a puzzling picture. Sarah's lesson plan book for the 1982-1983 school year, filled out completely through December. The handwriting was definitely hers, documenting plans for Christmas pageants and winter reading assignments she would never live to teach. A small journal with entries dated weeks after her disappearance. The writing was sparse, almost cryptic. September 15th, the silence is different here. Birds don't sing the same songs. October 3rd saw a cardinal today. Reminded me of Lynette's favorite Christmas ornament. November 20th, the leaves are falling. Time moves differently when no one is watching. A sealed envelope addressed to "My dearest Lynette" in Sarah's careful script. Inside was a letter that would break her sister's heart and deepen the mystery. Asterisk, "My beloved sister." Asterisk, asterisk, if you are reading this, then I suppose the time for pretending has finally ended. I cannot explain everything. Some truths are too dangerous to write down, and some secrets are meant to protect the people we love most. Asterisk, asterisk, I want you to know that I am not afraid, and I am not alone. There are things about our family, about Papa's work during the war, that we were never told. I learned something that summer that changed everything. I cannot come home, but I can keep you safe by staying away. Asterisk, asterisk, please, don't look for me. Please don't let anyone convince you that something terrible happened. I am where I need to be, even though it is not where I want to be. Asterisk, asterisk, tell my students that words are powerful things, that stories matter, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is disappear. Asterisk, asterisk, all my love. Asterisk, asterisk, Sarah asterisk, the blue sundress appeared to have been worn, then carefully cleaned and folded. Forensic analysis would later reveal traces of cotton field dust, creek water, and something else, pollen from wildflowers that didn't grow anywhere in Franklin County. Perhaps most puzzling was what investigators found tucked inside the journal's back cover. A photograph that no one had ever seen before. It showed Sarah standing beside a man in his 50s, both of them smiling in front of what appeared to be a small log cabin. The man was handsome in a rugged way, with grey hair and kind eyes. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, were the words, "Pine Ridge, Tennessee, September 1982, finally safe." But Earl Hutchinson had died in March 1981. More than a year before Sarah disappeared. How had her belongings ended up in his locked workshop? And who had access to the building after his death? Margaret Hutchinson, now in her 80s and living in a nursing home in Huntsville, was interviewed by investigators. Her memory was fragmented, but she recalled something that sent chills through the investigative team. Earl had a nephew. She told Detective Lisa Parker. Sweet boy. Worked for the government or something important like that. He used to come visit sometimes, always asking about the old workshop. Said he might want to rent it for storage. This was after Earl passed, you understand. I gave him the spare key. Figured it couldn't hurt anything. Margaret couldn't remember the nephew's name, and Earl's family had scattered across several states after his death. But she did remember one detail. He had the prettiest manners. That boy always called me Mrs. Hutchinson. Always brought flowers. Reminded me a little of a teacher. The way he talked so proper and polite. The discovery at the Sinclair station reignited media attention on the Sarah Ann Whitmore case. News trucks returned to Russellville for the first time in decades. The story made headlines across Alabama and Tennessee, with some outlets suggesting that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. Lynette Whitmore, now a mother of 3 living in Georgia, drove to Franklin County to meet with investigators. Reading her sister's letter was devastating, but it also provided a strange comfort. At least now I know she chose to leave, Lynette told reporters. For 23 years, I've imagined every horrible thing that might have happened to her. But this letter, ... it sounds like Sarah. It sounds like her making a decision to protect people she loved, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. The reference to their father's wartime work puzzled the family. Robert Whitmore had served in the Pacific during World War II, but as far as anyone knew, he'd been a regular infantry soldier. He'd died in 1975, taking whatever secrets he might have had to his grave. Investigators tracked down military records, but Robert Whitmore's service file contained only standard information deployment dates, unit assignments, commendations for bravery. If he'd been involved in classified work, the details weren't in any accessible database. The photograph from Pine Ridge, Tennessee, launched a new phase of the investigation. Pine Ridge was a small community in the Cumberland Mountains, about 150 miles northeast of Russellville. Local authorities there checked missing person reports and hotel registrations from 1982, but found no record of Sarah Ann Whitmore. However, they did find something interesting. A local man named David Holbrook had reported seeing a woman matching Sarah's description at a general store in September 1982. She'd been with an older man, and they'd bought supplies, like they were planning to stay in the mountains for a while. Holbrook remembered them because the woman had seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder. She was real polite, Holbrook told Tennessee state investigators. Thanked me for helping her carry groceries to their truck, but she kept looking around, like she was expecting trouble. The man with her, he seemed protective, kept one hand on her shoulder the whole time. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies. If Sarah's father had been involved in classified wartime activities, and if Sarah had somehow become a target because of that connection, it would explain her cryptic letter and her decision to disappear. But weeks of investigation yielded no concrete answers. The mysterious nephew who had rented Earl's workshop seemed to have vanished as completely as Sarah herself. The photograph led to dead ends. The letter raised more questions than it answered. As autumn 2005 arrived, bringing the familiar scent of wood smoke and dying leaves to Franklin County, the case began to quiet down again. The evidence from the workshop was preserved and catalogued, but without new leads, there was little more investigators could do. The old Sinclair station was eventually demolished, but the lot remained empty. Local residents said it felt wrong to build something new there, as if the ground itself was holding secrets that weren't ready to be disturbed. On quiet evenings, when the Alabama sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, people driving past the empty lot sometimes thought they saw shadows moving among the weeds, shadows that looked almost like a woman in a blue dress, walking slowly toward the tree line where all trails ended and all questions remained unanswered. The discovery at Earl's workshop had changed everything and nothing. Sarah Ann Whitmore was still missing, but now her disappearance felt less like a tragedy and more like a choicer sacrifice made for reasons that died with her father, and lived only in the secrets she'd carried into the Cumberland Mountains 23 years earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired postal worker named Eugene Gene Carver, who had been reading about the Sarah Ann Whitmore case in the Huntsville Times. Gene had worked for the U.S. Postal Service for 37 years, and something about the story nagged at him until he finally drove to Franklin County to speak with Sheriff Morrison. I kept thinking about that letter, Jean told the sheriff on a crisp October morning in 2005. The one the missing teacher supposedly wrote to her sister. Something about it reminded me of a case from way back, maybe 1983 or 84. We had this situation where letters were being mailed from a post office box, but the person who rented the box didn't match the name on the letters. Jean's memory was sharp, despite his 72 years. He recalled an incident where several letters had been mailed from a post office box in Coleman, Alabama, about 60 miles south of Russellville, signed by someone named Ann Roberts. The letters had been addressed to various family members across Alabama and Tennessee, each one explaining that Ann had decided to start a new life and didn't want to be contacted. Thing was, Jean continued, the handwriting analysis showed the letters were written by different people. Like somebody was helping folks disappear by writing letters in their name, you know. We reported it to the postal inspectors, but the trail went cold when the box rental expired. This information sent investigators down a new path. If Sarah hadn't written the letter herself, someone else had crafted it, using information about her family, then everything they thought they knew about her disappearance was wrong again. Detective Lisa Parker, who had been assigned to the Sarah Ann Whitmore case full-time since the workshop discovery, began investigating the Coleman connection. What she found was a network that had operated quietly for decades, helping people disappear when their lives were threatened. The operation had been run by a man named James Jim Carlton, a former military intelligence officer who had served in Korea and Vietnam. After retiring from the Army in 1978, Carlton had settled in rural Alabama and used his skills to help people who needed to vanish witnesses to crimes, abuse victims, people whose past had caught up with them in dangerous ways. Carlton had died in 1999, taking most of his secrets with him. But Detective Parker managed to track down his daughter, Rebecca Carlton Mills, who was living in Asheville, North Carolina, working as a family therapist. Dad never talked much about what he did after the Army, Rebecca told Detective Parker during a long phone conversation. But I knew he helped people sometimes, people who were in trouble, who needed to start over somewhere safe. He had this saying, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is help someone become someone else. Rebecca agreed to meet with investigators, and what she revealed changed everything about the Sarah Ann Whitmore case. In November 2005, Detective Parker and Sheriff Morrison drove to Asheville to interview Rebecca Carlton Mills. She was a woman in her 50s with her father's intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that made people want to confide in her. Over coffee, in a small cafe near downtown Asheville, she told them a story that had been weighing on her conscience for more than 20 years. In the summer of 1982, Dad got a call from someone he'd served with in the war. Rebecca began, I was home from college, working at Dad's small engine repair shop. That was his cover business, fixing lawnmowers and chainsaws. This man, I never knew his real name, but Dad called him Sergeant Bob, came to the house one evening in August. Sergeant Bob, Rebecca remembered, had been agitated and frightened. He'd brought a manila folder full of documents and photographs, spreading them across the kitchen table while speaking in urgent, hushed tones with her father. I wasn't supposed to hear any of it, Rebecca continued, but I was in the next room doing homework. They were talking about something that happened during the war, some kind of mission or operation. Sergeant Bob kept saying they found out and she's not safe. He was begging Dad to help his daughter disappear. The daughter, Rebecca learned years later, was a schoolteacher named Sarah Ann Whitmore. According to Rebecca's recollections, Robert Whitmore Sergeant Bob had been part of a classified intelligence operation during World War II. Long after the war ended, someone had been systematically tracking down and eliminating people who had knowledge of the operation. 3 of Whitmore's former unit members had died in apparent accidents over the previous 5 years, and now someone was asking questions about his family. Dad was very specific about the process, Rebecca explained. The disappearance had to look real, had to convince everyone that something bad had happened. That way, whoever was hunting for Sarah would stop looking and move on to other targets. James Carlton had orchestrated the entire plan. On the night of August 18, 1982, Sarah had attended the church fundraiser, as scheduled, establishing her presence and normalcy. But instead of driving straight home, she had met Carlton at a predetermined location, the clearing in the woods, where the Bloodhound's trail had ended. Dad always said the best place to meet someone was somewhere that felt isolated, but was actually visible from the road. Rebecca recalled, that way, if anyone was watching, they'd see the person arrive, but not necessarily see them leave us, especially if they left by a different route. From the clearing, Carlton had driven Sarah to the old Sinclair station, where Earl Hutchinson's nephew, who was actually one of Carlton's associates, was waiting. They had staged the abandoned car seat, placing Sarah's purse and the slice of pecan pie inside to make it appear as if she had been taken suddenly. Sarah had spent several days hidden in Earl's workshop, while Carlton arranged her new identity and transportation. The belongings found in the workshop years later had been deliberately placed there as a backup if Sarah's new life was ever compromised. Investigators would find the items and assume she had died, ending any further searches. The letter to her sister was Dad's idea, Rebecca admitted. He always left letters for families, explaining that their loved one had chosen to leave. It was cruel, but it was safer than the truth. If families believed their loved one was dead, they'd grieve and move on. If they thought the person was still alive somewhere, they'd keep looking. And that could put everyone in danger. Detective Parker asked the question that had been haunting the investigation. Is Sarah Ann Whitmore still alive? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. I don't know, she said finally. Dad's operation helped dozens of people over the years. Some of them stayed in touch, sending Christmas cards or calling on his birthday. Others vanished completely, which was probably safer for everyone. Sarah, ... I remember Dad mentioning her a few times over the years, always with this sad look in his eyes. I think she was one of the ones who could never come home. The revelation that Sarah's disappearance had been orchestrated as a protective measure rather than a crime shifted the entire investigation. Federal authorities became involved, reviewing classified documents from World War II to understand what Robert Whitmore might have known that was worth killing for. What they discovered was a web of intelligence operations, secret collaborations, and post-war cover-ups that stretched across decades. Robert Whitmore had indeed been involved in classified work specifically. He had been part of a team that helped relocate Nazi scientists and intelligence assets to the United States after the war, a program that later became controversial when details emerged in the 1970s. Some of the people Whitmore's team had brought to America had later become liabilities, war criminals, whose presence in the RUS could embarrass the government or provide ammunition for foreign adversaries. By the early 1980s, someone had been quietly eliminating witnesses to these operations, making their deaths look like accidents or natural causes. Sarah had become a target, not because of anything she had done, but because she was Robert Whitmore's daughter. In the twisted logic of intelligence work, killing the children of former operatives sent a message while eliminating potential future problems. Sarah Ann Whitmore was probably the bravest person involved in this whole mess. FBI agent David Chen told the investigative team in early 2006, she gave up everything: her career, her family, her entire identity, to protect her sister and to stop the cycle of violence. That takes a special kind of courage. The photograph found in Sarah's journal led to one final revelation. Pine Ridge, Tennessee, wasn't just a random location. It was one of several safe houses maintained by James Carleton's network. The man in the photograph was likely Marcus Webb, a former Army medic who had worked with Carleton to provide medical care and psychological support to people in the program. Webb had died in 1998, but investigators were able to track down records showing that a woman matching Sarah's description had lived quietly in the Pine Ridge area during the 1980s and early 1990s, working as a librarian under the name Ann Richardson. She had been well liked in the small community, known for her love of poetry and her volunteer work with local children. But Ann Richardson had disappeared from Pine Ridge in 1994, leaving behind only a note saying she needed to move on for personal reasons. The trail ended there, as completely as it had ended in the clearing outside Russellville 12 years earlier. As 2006 began, the official investigation into Sarah Ann Whitmore's disappearance was quietly closed. Federal authorities sealed most of the files related to the World War II intelligence operations, and local law enforcement was told that the case was resolved. Sarah had not been the victim of a crime, but rather a participant in a necessary protective operation. Lynette Whitmore was briefed on the basic facts, though many details remained classified. Learning that her sister had sacrificed everything to protect her was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. I used to blame myself for not doing more to find her, Lynette told Sheriff Morrison during their final meeting. But now I understand that Sarah didn't want to be found. She made the hardest choice a person can make. She chose our safety over her own happiness. That's who Sarah was. That's who she'll always be to me. The old mysteries of Franklin County had gained one more story. But this one was different from the others. Sarah Ann Whitmore hadn't been taken. She had walked away, step by step, into a life of shadows and silence, carrying her secrets like stones in her pockets, heavy enough to keep her submerged in anonymity, but precious enough to make the burden worthwhile. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the bells of First Baptist Church rang across the Alabama countryside, some longtime residents still thought about the gentle schoolteacher who had loved poetry and children, who had disappeared on a humid summer night and left behind only questions. But now they knew that somewhere, perhaps Sarah was listening to different church bells in a different town, still teaching in her way, still protecting the people she loved by staying away from them. The greatest acts of love, they realized, are sometimes the ones that remain forever invisible, forever unacknowledged, forever misunderstood by everyone except the person brave enough to perform them. In the spring of 2007, 25 years after Sarah Ann Whitmore walked away from everything she loved, the Franklin County Board of Education made a quiet decision that would ensure her memory lived on in the place where she had found her greatest joy. The new elementary school library, built with funds from a state education grant, was dedicated as the Sarah Ann Whitmore Memorial Library. The ceremony was small and private, attended by Lynette and her family, former colleagues who still remembered Sarah's gentle way with children, and a handful of students who had been in her classes a quarter-century earlier. Principal Dorothy Jenkins, now retired but still sharp at 78, spoke at the dedication. Sarah believed that books were doorways, she said, her voice carrying across the small gathering. She taught her students that every story was a chance to understand someone else's world, someone else's heart. This library will be her classroom forever. The library's centerpiece was a reading corner, designed exactly as Sarah had arranged her own classroom, comfortable chairs in a circle, soft lighting, and shelves filled with poetry books alongside children's stories. A small bronze plaque read simply, "In memory of Sarah Ann Whitmore, who taught us that words can change the world." But the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. Melissa Crane, the 7-year-old who had missed Sarah's poetry readings in 1982, had grown up to become an investigative journalist. It was Melissa who had first returned to Russellville to examine the cold case for a podcast series, and her work had helped uncover many of the details that led to the final revelation about Sarah's disappearance. "Miss Whitmore changed my life before I was even old enough to understand it," Melissa said at the library dedication. "She taught me that every person has a story worth telling, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that take decades to understand. She's the reason I became a journalist. She's the reason I came home to find the truth." The truth, as it had finally emerged, was more complex and more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Sarah Ann Whitmore had not been a victim, she had been a hero, making an impossible choice to protect innocent people from the dark consequences of history. Federal investigators had confirmed that at least 7 people connected to Robert Whitmore's wartime intelligence unit had died under suspicious circumstances between 1977 and 1983. The deaths had been carefully orchestrated to look accidental: a car crash in Montana, a hunting accident in Georgia, a heart attack in a Tennessee motel room. Each victim had been a potential witness to operations that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Sarah's disappearance had broken the pattern. When she vanished so completely that even professional investigators couldn't find her, the people hunting Whitmore's associates apparently concluded that the family line had been eliminated and moved on to other targets. Her sacrifice had not only saved her own life, but had likely saved Lynette and any future children from becoming targets themselves. The classified files that Agent Chen had reviewed painted a picture of moral compromise and necessary evils that had echoed across decades. The men and women who had served in Robert Whitmore's unit had been patriots, but they had also been keepers of secrets that grew more dangerous as time passed and political landscapes shifted. Sarah understood something that most people never have to face. Agent Chen had explained to Lynette during one of their final conversations. She understood that sometimes loving someone means staying away from them forever. That's not a choice anyone should have to make, but she made it with grace and courage. As the years passed after the library dedication, life in Russellville continued its steady rhythm. The town grew slowly, adding new businesses and neighborhoods, while maintaining the small-town character that had shaped Sarah's brief time there. The story of her disappearance became part of local history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But those who had known Sarah personally kept alive a different kind of memory. Every August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a few former students would meet at the library for an informal poetry reading. They would share verses by Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost, the poets Sarah had loved, and sometimes they would read their own attempts at capturing the beauty and mystery of their small Alabama town. "She taught us that words matter," said Jamie Patterson, who had been in Sarah's class during the 1981-1982 school year. "Even when she was gone, that lesson stayed with us. Some of us became teachers because of her. Others became writers or parents who read to our children every night. She's still teaching, even now." Lynette Whitmore Davidson visited the library once a year, usually in late spring when the dogwood trees were blooming and the air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle. She would sit in the reading corner and page through books of poetry, remembering her sister's voice and the dreams they had shared as children. During one of these visits, in 2012, Lynette discovered something that took her breath away. Hidden between the pages of an old copy of Emily Dickinson's complete works was a handwritten note in Sarah's distinctive script. Asterisk. "For Lynette, when you find this, know that I am still teaching somewhere, still reading poetry to children who need to hear that words can heal hearts. I chose this life so you could live yours freely. That was always the right choice. Your loving sister, S." Asterisk. The note had been placed in the book years earlier, though no one could say when or how. Library staff had no record of Sarah ever visiting after her disappearance, but somehow she had found a way to leave one final message for her sister. Lynette kept the note private for several years, treasuring it as a last gift from the sister she had lost but never stopped loving. When she finally shared it with Melissa Crane in 2015, it became the emotional conclusion to a documentary film that Melissa had spent years creating about the case. "The Sarah Ann Whitmore story isn't really about a missing person," Melissa explained in the film's final moments. "It's about the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. It's about sacrifice and courage, and the fact that some mysteries are more beautiful than any solution could ever be." The documentary aired on regional television and streaming platforms, bringing Sarah's story to a wider audience. Viewers from across the country sent letters to the Franklin County Library, sharing their own stories of loss and love, of difficult choices and quiet courage. Many of the letters came from teachers who saw something of themselves in Sarah's devotion to her students. Others came from families who had experienced unexplained disappearances and found comfort in the possibility that their loved ones had chosen to leave rather than being taken. But perhaps the most moving response came from a librarian in Oregon who identified herself only as a Her letter, postmarked from a small mountain town, contained a simple message. Sarah's students were fortunate to have a teacher who loved them enough to give up everything for their safety. Poetry still has the power to heal. The lessons continue in unexpected places. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and investigators found no evidence that the letter had any connection to Sarah Ann Whitmore. But Lynette kept the letter anyway, filing it with the other precious documents that told her sister's story: the final police report, the photographs from the workshop discovery, and the poem that had been found in Mrs. Daniels' attic all those years ago. As 2020 approached, marking nearly 40 years since Sarah's disappearance, Franklin County had changed dramatically. The old downtown had been revitalized with antique shops and coffee houses. The cotton fields had given way to subdivisions and strip malls. Many of the people who had known Sarah personally had passed away or moved on to other places, but the library that bore her name remained a constant, a place where children still gathered in circles to hear stories, where teenagers discovered the power of poetry, where adults found refuge in books during difficult times. Sarah's reading corner had become sacred space, touched by an invisible presence that seemed to encourage quiet contemplation and gentle learning. On a humid evening in August 2022, exactly 40 years after Sarah Ann Whitmore had attended her last church fundraiser, a small group gathered at the library for a memorial service. Lynette was there, now a grandmother herself, along with Melissa Crane and a handful of Sarah's former students who had traveled back to Russellville for the occasion. They read poetry as the Alabama sun set through the library windows, casting long shadows across the shelves where Sarah's memory lived, alongside the accumulated wisdom of countless other voices. They spoke about the mystery that had shaped their understanding of love and sacrifice, and about the teacher who had shown them that some gifts are too precious to be given openly. As twilight deepened into night, the group prepared to leave. But Lynette lingered for a few moments alone in the reading corner. She touched the bronze plaque that bore her sister's name, and whispered the words that had taken her 40 years to truly understand. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for staying away so we could stay safe. Thank you for teaching us that love sometimes looks like absence, and that the greatest courage is found in the choices that nobody ever sees. Outside, the Alabama countryside settled into another night of cricket songs and firefly dances. Somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, a woman who had once been Sarah Ann Whitmore was living quietly under another name, still teaching in her way, still carrying the weight of secrets that had protected the people she loved most. The case was closed, but the story continued not in police files or newspaper headlines, but in the hearts of students who had learned to love words, in the memory of a sister's sacrifice, and in the enduring power of choices made in darkness so that others could live in light. In the end, Sarah Ann Whitmore had achieved a kind of immortality that she never could have planned. She lived on, not as a victim or a mystery, but as a testament to the quiet heroism that exists in ordinary people who find themselves faced with extraordinary circumstances. Some mysteries, the people of Franklin County had learned, are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be honored, remembered, and passed down as reminders that love, in its purest form, sometimes requires the greatest sacrifice of all, the willingness to be misunderstood forever by almost everyone, so that a few precious souls can live free from the shadows of the past. And in the Sarah Ann Whitmore Memorial Library, where children still gather to hear stories and discover the magic of words, her greatest lesson continues to unfold, one reader at a time, one story at a time, one act of quiet courage at a time.